Good morning, good afternoon. I want to begin our virtual Women Get on Board speaker series with our acknowledging the land on which I live is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabes and the Hautechinis. The Upper Canada Treaties covers this territory. It is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon, the Wampum Agreement, and is directly adjacent to the Haldimand Treaty Territory. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to enjoy the natural surroundings of this territory. I encourage all of us to become actively involved in understanding why land acknowledgements are important and understanding Indigenous histories and contemporary Indigenous issues in Canada. Welcome. I'm Deborah Rosati, founder and CEO of Women Get on Board. We are a social purpose company celebrating 10 years of getting more women on boards. Women Get on Board is committed to elevating the next generation of women corporate directors through our mission of connecting, promoting, and empowering women to serve on corporate boards with confidence and courage. We are delighted to be here today to host this virtual speaker series with our sponsor, Southlea Group. We have a very exciting topic on executive compensation excellence and aligning pay with strategy. Super excited to introduce Alex Pattillo, Amanda Voegeli, and Ryan Resch. And I'm not going to, without further ado, I'm going to turn it right over to you, Amanda, because I know you have a lot to share, a lot to say. I will see you at Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. We're very excited to be here also. We really appreciate the partnership that Southlea Group and Women on Board have had for multiple years now. So you can see the timeline there. As Deborah said, there is a Q&A section. You can pop your questions into the chat function if you want to, and we'll get to them at a later time in the hour. So just jumping right in, Keisha, thank you. This is the second of our two-part series on the Human Resources Committee and executive compensation. So if you missed the first one, it was on January 30th, and it covered exciting topics more aligned with the Human Resources Committee. So setting up an effective Human Resources Committee, creating an effective Human Resources Committee, and in terms of agendas and time management and focus. And it also touched on the expanding role of the Human Resources Committee. So if those are topics of interest, I'm sure you can grab the recording from Women Get on Board, or as the slides suggest, you can download our full toolkit, which has a lot more content that we're able to cover in these short conversational sessions right from our website. You can see there, southlea.com. So most board members think that they're asking the right questions when it comes to executive compensation, but are they? Today, we're going to talk about some foundational elements of doing a great job of executive compensation oversight and management at the board level. Developing a compensation philosophy is the critical foundational part of building what will be the foundation of how you make good decisions on all pay program designs and the decisions associated with pay for performance. Effective compensation benchmarking is also critical. How do you know how much is enough? How do you make sure that it's sufficient? And what are we aligning to anyway? And incentive plan designs are created to align, as we said, and this the whole purpose of this conversation is aligned to the business strategy and the talent strategy of each organization. So we'll go through each of these in order with the three of us here. On the next page, for those of you who don't know us, Southlea Group is one of Canada's largest leading executive compensation and governance advisory firms. It's founded by 4 partners, formerly of Willis Towers Watson. 3 of them are here today with you. We built this company with something different in mind. We built it on the basis of that we were passionate about providing not only data, but also our insights. Each of us have between 15 and up to 30 years of experience. And so we like to apply that knowledge, experience, and practicality to the data and research and insights that we provide our clients. We also are unique in that we can offer global insights, but that we are local. Through our partnership of the GECN group, we have access to over 150 professionals and 35 offices around the world. I'm here, as Deborah said, with Ryan and Alex. I'm Amanda Voegeli, and I'm the managing partner of Southlea Group. I'm super passionate about what we do and what I do because, as I said, I get to do what I love to do, applying my years of experience in a practical way to solve new and interesting business challenges linked to compensation. So why take time to develop a compensation philosophy? Well, when a compensation philosophy is well done, it serves as the foundation for building on good decisions and appropriate pay decisions for your organization. It starts with really understanding your business strategy and what are the keys to success? What is the definition of performance? What are the key indicators of success? And how is your talent strategy designed to support that specific business strategy? All organizations have a business strategy and all should have a talent strategy that articulates the linkage between those two. How does the business get done through its people? Then we want to clarify the pay for performance objectives. So again, all organizations have objectives. You have a mission, a mandate, you have a reason to exist. Clarifying the pay for performance objectives is the step where you get really clear and crisp on which are the key priorities and the key metrics, and how do we want to pay to motivate people to execute on those objectives. And finally, articulating a peer group and benchmarking methodology is also critical. Far too often, compensation philosophies get a short end of the stick in that everyone says, we pay median, we pay 50th percentile. The critical question is against what? To whom is this 50th percentile benchmarking completed? So definitely something you want to spend more time than less on articulating your peer group and your benchmarking methodology so that you can answer that question really authentically against whom and at what level. So Ryan, I know you have lots of experience in this area. You might be one of those people with almost 30 years of experience. And I was thinking you could share some of your experience because I know that this is actually quite challenging and it depends on the environment in which your business operates in order to be really customized into how this is developed. Maybe you can share.
Yeah, no, happy to. And I think you're absolutely right that this becomes sort of the foundation of almost everything that we do. And it's an area where sometimes we don't spend enough time in terms of articulating the reasons for why we pay what we pay. And it does become the foundation for how do we make effective decisions, because depending what we do here, we can get radically different outcomes in terms of pay levels. So the story I wanted to share was a transportation organization owned by the government, but needs to operate on a financial self-sustaining basis. And so they had historically looked at peer companies that were both within the public sector, so other sort of crown corporations and independent government-owned entities, but they also looked separately at publicly traded private organizations because they sort of hovered within that space. And from a talent perspective, they felt that both markets were relevant. But as you can imagine, the pay levels within public sector organizations versus publicly traded organizations is materially different, both in terms of the quantum of pay and how they pay. So in publicly traded companies, more often the majority weighting of pay ends up coming through long-term incentives, which are sometimes used but are not as common within the public sector. And so as a result of this process that they went through, they had adopted a medium-term incentive plan because they thought, okay, if we're comparing against private sector organizations, we should have an MTIP. They then realized very quickly over a couple of cycles that they couldn't effectively set 3-year goals. Because of the nature of the organization, the mission, the impact of the external market on their performance, it wasn't realistic or meaningful to have good outcome-based measures within the MTIP. And so what happened is we went through this discussion around, so what's the philosophy? What do we mean by pay for performance? This isn't working, the MTIP. It became a bit of a circular discussion that we then stepped back and said, well, does it actually even make sense that we compare to private sector organizations? If we can't deliver pay in a similar way that other private sector organizations can deliver pay? Should we be focusing more on the public sector organizations and disregard the private sector organizations? And so that's what we did. We focused on the public sector. We said that these public sector organizations, we were probably at the higher end of complexity relative to these organizations. So we were comfortable paying at the higher end of the market range within those organizations. And then we also decided that we were going to get rid of the MTIP and reallocate the pay between salary and STIP. And so we still have a performance-oriented plan. We still have incentives in place that are aligned with strategy, but it's in a much simpler way. It's more aligned from a business perspective, and I think we got better outcomes in the end. But we had to sort of step back and go, who are we as a business, and what makes sense from a business perspective, rather than just kind of defaulting down this path of what does everyone else do, and therefore we need to sort of align directly. So it was an interesting way of looking at the philosophy and customizing it in a way that really made sense for
Right.
them.
I think it's a great example of balancing the business. As you said, it actually is government owned and need to be careful about the funds and the cost structure that we put in place as it relates to a compensation program. But you also had to reflect on the talent strategy and the types of individuals and the experience of the individuals that were required to execute on that strategy.
Yeah.
So that's a great example.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of others where, and we could probably keep telling, different stories. And, when you get into publicly traded companies, we spend a lot of time around peer groups and trying to define how we select peers. But as we know, the Canadian market's small, and so it's not an easy process, right? And that's where really being clear around size, scope, complexity becomes so critical to how we define an appropriate peer group, because as we know, those levers really sort of drive what the pay outcomes can be, and so we need to make sure it's defensible and truly aligns with the organization.
Yeah, and a couple tactical add-ons to what we're saying here. One is the compensation philosophy. We probably could have called it total rewards philosophy, just as an asterisk, in that many of your organizations, you think about salaries, incentives where they exist, both a short-term and a long-term. But in many organizations, pensions are very valuable, and you need to make sure that you include the value of that as you do your benchmarking, and also have a statement about, is it a meaningful part or is it not a meaningful part of the overall package, as an example. So you keep that in mind. Total rewards is also another way to talk about compensation. And I would also say, as board members, this is a piece of paper. Like it is a document that should live and breathe and should be updated on a regular basis to make sure it continues to align with your business strategy and your talent strategy. Far too often, sometimes when we come into organizations, we find it's sort of like 3 sentences. Everyone says they have a compensation philosophy, but it kind of gets tossed to the side. But as we said, and we keep reiterating, going through this process is well worth the while to have the conversations, as Ryan shared, about the organizations from which we compete, why our compensation systems and programs are going to look similar or different from peers, as an example. So you do need to go through this process. It's a critical first step, and that's why we talked about it first.
Yeah, and it evolves, right? Like businesses evolve, strategies change. You go from being more growth oriented to less, and so the definition of performance changes. The peers that you compare will change over time. So you're absolutely right. Something to keep a regular look at. But as we jump in then to the next step, so now we've defined a peer group, we've sort of established clarity around how are we going to compare our pay relative to market. We get into the ever so fun discussion around compensation benchmarking. And so this is where, as compensation professionals, we spend a lot of time on this, trying to at least synthesize and keep things as simple as possible. But we also recognize this is an area where there can be a lot of numbers, a lot of graphs, a lot of complexity from a board perspective. So we wanted to sort of step back and just sort of provide you with the overview. Obviously, the toolkit gets into some more specifics in terms of how to apply this within your organization. But to Amanda's point around the total rewards philosophy or even a compensation philosophy, the starting point for benchmarking is that we need to consider all elements of compensation. So when we say this, there is a sort of a stacking of elements, right? You've got a salary. In many cases, you have incentives, short, long-term incentives. And then there's other benefits or other, pensions that get factored into that. And so oftentimes we get into this and what's been done in the past is that they've looked at salary, on its own. But it's so important that we take the holistic look at all of the elements, and then we can start to make decisions as to if we're competitive on an overall basis. Does that also mean that we're competitive on each of the elements, or do we make conscious decisions around trading off, say, a higher salary for lower incentives or vice versa, right? Or do we want to put more into long-term incentives and less into salary? And understanding the implications of those trade-offs is sort of a key point. But what we wanted to sort of get across here is that we don't want to lose sight of what is the total package being offered and how do we align relative to market on a total basis. And then we get into the discussion, and Amanda said, most philosophies say we target the 50th percentile of the market, and that is sort of what, is sort of the most common articulation of a philosophy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be that way. And so this is again where you can have a discussion around, is it 50th percentile across all elements, or is it that we want to be at the 75th percentile on salary and lower on incentive pay? Is it that we have certain roles in the organization that we'd like to pay higher than 50th? So we look at from a talent perspective or a skills perspective. We had one case where technology was critically important to the business, and they would pay and position pay at the 75th percentile for that role versus 50th percentile for the other roles. So it's being very deliberate about why we choose certain market positioning and the rationale for doing so, and not just necessarily defaulting to 50th percentile just because everyone else, and it's sort of seen as sort of the default position that you need to start from. I think there needs to be a discussion as to, where does it make sense to be at, above, or below median. And then finally, it's also helpful sometimes because in Canada, particularly, we have a small market. And so when we define a peer group, it might not be ideal in terms of, organizations that are exactly like us. And so therefore, it can be helpful to have multiple reference points. So this is where maybe you need to look outside of industry. Maybe you need to look at different ownership models. So as I said, do you look at public sector separately from the private sector and then be able to determine what is a reasonable market range? So having multiple reference points can be helpful as you look at market data, because oftentimes we get locked into, we need to determine a number, right? That we need to determine, the P50 is X, and therefore we need to pay X. And what we want to try to get across here is that market data is imperfect. And so we need to sort of apply judgment. And this is where the role of the board comes in, to be able to say, we considered, what does the different elements of market pay look like? We consider our organization relative to these other organizations. We considered the incumbent in the role and their contributions to the organization. And then we've made a conscious decision to pay relative at a certain point relative to market, recognizing that there's some noise in the market data. We need to be in a reasonable range of the market data, but we don't have to be at a specific point. And so perhaps I can turn it over to Alex to share a little bit more, to provide, I guess, some more color in terms of what does this actually mean, because I know I threw out a lot. This is a complicated area, so hopefully you can provide a bit of clarity.
Yeah, as you were describing this, Ryan, I was nodding my head because I can think of a case study that represents this well. We were benchmarking pay levels, so the quantum of pay for the senior executive team of a mid-sized food packaging company. And what was interesting about the profile of this company is that they are publicly traded in Canada. They have a Canadian-based executive team, But the wrinkle is that they have operations in the US and Canada. And then when they think about their talent market, they truly hand on heart say it's North American or global in some cases. So how do you think about all those different considerations when benchmarking pay? For them, they also had a compensation philosophy following the steps you were laying out to define that they put more weight on cash compensation and pension and a little less weight on equity. So if you were to look at each of the individual elements, it would tell a very different story against the market. So we had to be thoughtful about looking at total pay for them against total pay in the market. The majority of the market data that we collected for this company was from proxy disclosure. And as we all know, that's public information that usually by the time you're actually including in the benchmark data, it can be a year or two old. So we had to be thoughtful about trying to age or apply adjustments to the data to represent the year that we were benchmarking. When we dig into the details of trying to match our clients' roles to the individual benchmark roles in the market data, sometimes you'll find that there's some nuance. The roles that you're matching to might be founders or have different levels of experience. So you have to be thoughtful about how to incorporate that data into your information. So for us, we had founder executives in the data set that had atypical pay. They were either paying very low or very high or had different pay elements than what we expected. So we ended up removing that from the data set to have the data more robust. Then we got into having the data and we were looking at it and applying good judgment to decide where to position roles. Working with the committee, there was feedback that, well, our supply chain officer is so critical to our strategy that we want to make sure pay is competitive. So for that role, total compensation was set to be above median. But then reflecting on, they had a new executive incumbent as part of the leadership team. And so it was conscious to set pay below the median for that person to build in some buffer that over time you can progress compensation as they develop and gain experience in their role. So they did have a segmented approach for whether it was the role or the person in the role, but for the rest of the executives, they anchored to the median. And then in terms of the multiple reference points, there's a few different ways that this can come up. In this company example, because they had a North American peer group, they had some companies that were paying in Canadian dollars, some in US dollars. So we looked at the data on a par currency, so not converting. That provided one data set. Then we also looked at, well, what if we do convert to Canadian dollars? And that provided another data point. A third reference was looking at some survey data. So if the proxy data was looking at North American industry specific, the survey data could provide Canadian and broader industry. And so in this case, the two different data points supported each other. It presented a reasonable range of information for the committee to use some judgment.
Yeah, but I think sometimes that it doesn't work out as nicely as that, right? And that's where, we need to make some decisions as to, going back fundamentally from a peer group perspective, if there are significant differences between these multiple reference points, just understanding why and whether or not those points are valid, right? Like, and that's where, it's important for the board to be clear around the talent market or the scope and complexity to go, is this actually representative? Or is there some reason why there's such a significant difference?
To your point, if you think about what the purpose of a multiple reference point is, it's trying to gain confidence in the data set that you're using. And so it's great when the data aligns and it tells a similar story, but if it doesn't, you really do need to explore why. It could be that the two samples represent different size of organizations or different industries in this case, which suggests that an industry might pay a premium or a discount to a broader set of data. And then when you have this information, giving good rationale for why the differences exist and how you might position pay against one sample versus another. You might decide that one sample is a primary peer group and the other is a secondary, or you might feel comfortable anchoring to the median of one sample and the 25th percentile of another. So it really does require you to understand and evaluate the different data sets.
Maybe I would just jump in and say that if you're lucky to be in a Canadian company that does have peers, it's a lot easier than what we just described. So when you have a company, Canadian company that is in an industry, oil and gas, financial services, technology, where you do have a plethora of peers, the key to executive compensation benchmarking is size, scope, and complexity, as mentioned a couple times. And so size matters is kind of a key takeaway here. Your peer group industry matters if you can get to it, another key takeaway. If you can't get to it, then it goes more to where Alex is saying, or if you happen to be in Canada with a company that is of a strange size or structure, or in a strange industry, like there's only 2 or 3 of you, the unit, we say you need 12 to 15 companies to make a sufficiently robust peer group, as an example. So sometimes it's a little easier than that, but we did want to share a case study where it gets complex, because in Canada, there just are not enough organizations to do the direct quick peer groups all the time.
Yeah. So the third topic that is covered in our toolkit and is a topic of a lot of conversation when we're working with boards and HR committees is how to design an incentive plan that delivers pay for performance. And so, well, it might be a good topic for your next dinner party, which is, do incentive plans really motivate performance? Do they actually change behaviors? And so as compensation consultants, we certainly have experience where we've seen poorly designed plans that don't drive or align pay with performance. They may not motivate performance, or they could motivate the wrong performance. However, when designed right, we truly do believe that they can focus attention, they reinforce key messages, they do create that alignment between the participants and the investor and ownership group. So then it's a question of, where do you begin? As Amanda mentioned earlier, every business has a set of objectives. They're trying to improve operations or protect market share, low growth or high growth, offer new products, enter new markets. So there is a reason why the business exists. And then you're defining a strategy to achieve those objectives, and a talent strategy to identify the skills or experience necessary to achieve the strategy and objectives. So the incentive plan is really just connecting all of those themes. And it starts with defining the principles. Why do you need an incentive plan? What is the purpose? What's the time frame? Who will participate? And is your underlying motivation, is it to drive performance, or is it to retain, or a combination of both? Once you start to get into those design principles, you want to customize the incentive plan with those business strategies. And it brings up interesting discussions with the design team around, what time frame are you measuring performance? Is it annual goals or goals that require a longer time frame to achieve? Are the goals set at a company level where it requires teamwork across the organization to achieve company outcomes? Or are you defining it at a business or function level? Or it might be within an individual scorecard where it's specific to the role. The metrics themselves may be outcomes, or they might be drivers. And what we mean is, an outcome could be, I want to grow earnings, whereas a driver would be, I want to increase market share, and I want to have disciplined cost management. And the combination of those two things, growing revenue and managing cost, will result in higher earnings. You may decide that we want to have a set of measures that are very quantitative and formulaic, and so the numbers speak for themselves, or there's some measures that are really important to the business, but it requires judgment and discretion. So you have a structure in place to define how you'll evaluate performance. And then if you lay out all of those things, what are the critical measures, over what time frame, et cetera, you might decide, I can't reflect this in a single incentive plan. I may need multiple incentive plans. And that's where we get into the annual plan versus a midterm plan or a longer term plan. Once you have the framework in place, that's where some of the hard work begins in terms of actually setting the targets and the range around those targets. And this isn't an easy exercise. The purpose of an incentive plan is to motivate performance. So you're trying to find that balance between motivating higher performance, but also making it realistic. because if you set something that is too challenging, it reduces some of the motivation. It takes away some of the perceived value of the program. And in terms of the actual setting of those targets, there's different ways or considerations. Looking back at your historical performance, comparing to your annual budget, thinking about your longer term forecast. What are your peer companies doing in terms of setting goals? What are analysts expecting? So it does really require multiple lenses to set that target. And then finally, it's aligning pay to the performance. So at what different performance outcomes, what is the relationship with pay? Does that feel right overall? Can you afford the plan? And then at an individual level, what does it mean? Is it motivating? Will it keep people at the organization to realize these goals? So then once you have the incentive programs in place, they're only as valuable as the motivation and the communication that's shared. So you have to implement these things. And we've seen it time and time again where companies fall short of sharing what is the purpose of the plan, how does it link to the strategy, what's the rationale for measures, how can participants actually contribute to achieving those goals, and then what is the link between pay and performance to create the motivation. So Amanda, curious if this resonates with you. I'm sure you have, I know you have a lot of experience designing these things. Where do companies get it right or wrong? And you're on mute. You're just on mute, Amanda.
There we go. What I was going to say is that as a board member, the question that you should be asking is, at a high level, should we have incentives? And flipping around your dinner party question, do we have the right incentive that is creating behavior or motivating impact? Because frankly, you shouldn't have a pay for performance strategy if it's not doing that. Your job is to, as a board member, to make sure that you do see the business strategy in the incentive plan. That's a nice way I like to say to organizations, do you see it? You should be able to take a step back and look at the short-term incentive plan and the long-term incentive plan and be like, yep, this makes sense with what we're trying to get done within our organization. And if it doesn't, then there's some work that needs to be done. Sharing some stories from both a private environment and a publicly traded company environment, the process is the same in terms of, as Alex articulated, the key to the most successful incentive design is clarity of business strategy. We always say compensation design has to follow strategy. If your business strategy is unclear, it makes our jobs incredibly hard to make effective incentive programs. Private company example of a mutual, I'll call it a mutual company. And again, showing that all companies, even a mutual company that is technically a not-for-profit, when you think about what is its mission and mandate, it is to deliver services to its members. And how do we make sure that we can deliver those services to members? We have to make money. And in this case, it's an insurance business that has products designed for that niche group of beneficiaries who happen to be members, but also they realized, and they had started to realize, but it's a business, and it is a business that needs to run efficiently and effectively to make the money such that they can spend the money on the reason it exists and support its beneficiaries in the way that they need to. So through the process of discussing with the board, with management, with finance, we did identify that even as a mutual, our objective was to grow book value. Book value is a complicated measure for many to understand, but truly it is what will allow us to make sure we have the funds necessary to fund the other projects. And the point is that the management team over time needs to show trending upward in that measure. If it's reducing book value over time, they are destroying value. It is something that you as a board should be monitoring in circumstances like this. So everyone agreed, management and the board agreed, this is a great improvement on what is a long-term incentive metric. It's very crisp, it's aligned with who we are and what we need to execute on. And we'll use it as an opportunity to educate people on how do you move book value over time such that we can continue to create value for our members. So that's one example of a more private company, a little more complex. Also, of course, restricted a bit by the fact it's a private company. Most private companies are restricted to 3 years because of our Canadian tax rules, because most settle in cash. As a public company example, any of you that work in public companies or are on board members of public companies, there has been a tendency to a norm pattern. And if I'm talking about long-term incentives in particular right now, stock options have sort of been I say painted with an ugly stick, because we like stock options used in the right way, in the right, package with the right governance around it. But what the portfolio package of long-term incentives for most mid to large size publicly traded companies would look like at least 50% of the mix of long-term incentive vehicles performance share units. And the reason why that has happened is really because of external pressures and guidance from ISS and Glass Lewis. The proxy shareholder bodies have said that you need to have at least 50% of your long-term incentives performance, and they do not call share price performance. So you get stuck in this box where it needs to at least be 50% performance share units, and you can decide what the performance is, as we just discussed, linked to your business strategy. The next 50% is split between restricted share units, which do track share price and dividend behavior over the 3 years of vesting, and or stock options, which both we believe have performance in them because share price is an indication of success or failure, just not in the books of ISS and Glass Lewis. So you end up with this portfolio of LTIPs that generally look kind of close to one another. But going fully back to our conversation about compensation philosophy, that is a choice. And the weighting between 50% performance share units and only 20% stock options is because you as an organization want it to have that type of risk profile for your employees, or you want it to look similar to the way in which they are paid in other organizations. If you wanted to have a high growth, high focus on share price, we actually would advocate for 50% to be in stock options, as an example. So because they're the highest levered and the longest terms, we think there really is a role for that. So reflecting on the process is the same, looking at the business strategy and putting it into the vehicles that you have available to you as either a public company or a private company. And I think I would reiterate what Alex said, and where the biggest pitfall is on effective incentive design is not getting the performance metrics right that are aligned with the business strategy and where you are at now. We're finding a lot of organizations right now are in transformation, or they're doing work within the business to kind of do big steps to set themselves up for more mature business functions. So it's your business strategy now. What does it say now? How are we making sure that that's reflected in the incentive, and that we're motivating executives to be focused, employees, anyone participating in, to be motivated on the right priorities? We also say, and should it be in the short-term plan or should it be in the long-term plan? As Alex said, we don't want to see it in both plans. So you have to make a determination of the key metrics, and then is it a 1-year measure or is it a 3 or plus measure? And I would say that the biggest issue is in the identification of the key performance metrics, surprisingly.
Yeah, just to echo on one of those pitfalls, because you're right that often we'll design a great annual incentive plan. Awesome. We're going ahead with this plan, and we have a great long-term incentive plan, but it requires that step back to look at them together and then realize, well, wait a minute, we put a lot of weight on that long-term plan and a little less weight on the cash program. So when we look at the relative weight on measures, all of a sudden we have 60% weight on share price. Maybe that's okay, because that, it's all based on delivering shareholder value over time. Or you might say, ooh, 60% is a lot. We want to try to scale that back and put a little bit more weight on the measures that are in the short-term plan. So it's, again, taking a holistic view, as Ryan brought up earlier, holistic review of total compensation, and then the relative emphasis on measures when they're baked into different incentive plans.
So those are the 3 main topics. I do want to keep time for the Q&A. There are some questions in there, but in closing, the questions that we ask ourselves sitting around the boardroom table around how do we communicate and be aligned on our position around what is the purpose of each compensation element sits in the compensation philosophy. Also, how much is enough or how much is too much? Again, it's all in the eye of the beholder. It has to do with good process around thinking through the most appropriate peer groups, and then how do we use that data, like Alex talked about, and then incentive design, getting the pay. How do we get the pay for performance alignment right is one of the most critical jobs that a board can do. And it really goes down to, again, take a step back, see if you can see your business strategy in the incentive design. Is it sending the right messages to employees about what's important and what you're willing to pay for? Deborah.
Well, Amanda, Ryan, and Alex, very engaging conversations. A little on the technical, but a little on the practical at the same time. So I love how you bring it together. So as my colleague Keisha has said in the chat, please put your questions in. So we do have a few questions, and hopefully a few more will come in. So the first question we have, and Amanda, I'll let you decide who answers it from your end. So when doing market analysis for compensation review, is it appropriate to segregate public from private organizations? The peer group is a public funded school board, but we have to compete with other employers. If we target a pay at the 50th percentile of public, but let me get it. Okay, then we're just really going to below market as we're not including the full universe of jobs. I'm thinking of non-teaching jobs like IT, accounting, HR, facilities, and transportation. Did you get that in the essence of that?
Unless anyone else really wants to take it, I can mention something for you, Carmen, in terms of we do work across some larger not-for-profits. Similarly, not you have to be careful with the funds that you're using, and we totally understand there is a market for that, and there is a price point at which is appropriate to pay, but there is the reality of that you need good people to come into work, and it has a little bit to do with the value proposition of that job too, like in terms of what is the trade-off between working here versus another place. But I would say we actually recommend for organizations like this to buy a survey that's done by TELUS because it has both samples. And I actually do think it's important to separate them, because then you know what you're looking at. And then it's a decision. If you're looking at, public data versus private data, you'll find that the private data does tend low and public is going to tend high. So you make a business decision on where you want to spend the money. And you'll also see where there are bigger gaps and where there are smaller gaps. So are you being fair or unfair to people, and why?
Thank you. It was sort of a layered question. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that. So a couple more questions coming in. To what extent do you see title creep impacting compensation, and what can a committee do to address this?
Right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't look at titles,
Yeah.
would be my answer, because you're absolutely right. Like, you look at organizations, you get, people becoming SVPs or EVPs or chiefs, and so you have to break it down. When looking at executives, it's more about the level they are within the organization. Do they report directly to the CEO, or do they report to another executive that reports to the CEO? So reporting level matters more than title. And then the functional responsibilities are more important in terms of what is the portfolio that they're responsible for, and are there actually meaningful teams in each of those areas? Because again, you see title creep where they are X function plus Y function plus Z function, and then you realize that the Z function has one manager reporting into it, and it's not really a function. So again, it's get beyond title, look more at what level they are in the organization, and be very clear about what are they truly responsible for in terms of the function, and then you'll get a better sense of being able to manage that.
Yeah, I can add example. The one I love is where we are asked to benchmark a chief operating officer versus a chief operations officer. And so if you look at it really quickly, you might say, well, those are both matched to a COO, a chief operating officer, but the devil's in the details of, are they managing multiple functions within an organization? Do they have truly a chief, very senior executive role, or is it more of a top operations officer? So to Ryan's point, understanding the responsibilities of the role will then inform what the right benchmark match is.
Thank you. So a few more questions. Do you have any examples of real world scenarios where an organization can choose a below the 50th percentile for a segment within their compensation philosophy? Do you want me to repeat?
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
mean, you're absolutely right, because it's always easiest to say that you're going to be at P50 or above. So can you consciously say you're lower? There are lots of organizations where, particularly around salary, where they'll take a more conservative position around salary. And so you'll see this documented that they'll pay at the 25th or the 30th percentile for salary, but then they make it up in incentive pay. So it's harder perhaps to say that overall we target below market, but it's fairly common to see that certain elements could be below if they're offset by others at a higher level.
The only place I've seen that actively, it's not way below market, but sometimes not for profits because the value proposition is different. So you're paying like 10% less salary, but you're giving more days off, as an example, which is worth real money to certain people. Like we can mathematically say how much that would have cost the organization. And in a not-for-profit, if someone can get the job done in 4 days and have summer Fridays, more power to them. And so it is a little light on salary and bonus, but you get a great lifestyle. And they explicitly say that your salary's not the highest, but you're paid fairly and what we can afford, but you get days off and a little bit higher of a pension contribution in the example that I'm thinking of.
We sometimes see it with growth companies too. So they will be growing quickly. It's hard to define a peer group that reflects current state because in a year from now, they're gonna be a very different company. So they might define a peer group that reflects their future state in the next 12 to 18 months. And so they might consciously decide to set pay below median today and then revisit in the future.
I did an Amanda, sorry.
Yeah.
Not that you're the only person that's ever done that.
Only I do that.
Only I. Well, I join you today. So continuing on with the questions, the next one, sorry, I just got to get there we go. How do you incorporate significant upfront one-time stock awards tied to stock appreciation into the analysis of benchmarking?
Well, I'll take a step first. You definitely do include it because sometimes we get pushback that it should not be included because it was special, but you do just average it over a reasonable period of time. Like usually when you grant a one-time stock option, you should be thinking about that, like for what horizon am I even doing this for? And often it's between 3 and 5 years is sort of a rule of thumb, but it would depend on how big it is, how long it vests for, and how difficult it is. But we do try and put a valuation on it and spread it over a period of time, both for a client, if a client has done that, but also in the market data, it should include specials with some sort of smoothing applied to it.
And you do also get into the challenge with long-term incentives in terms of the valuation. And so most often we focus on what is the value, what is the estimated value of that award at the time of grant, so applying some type of a model to estimate what that value is. But at the same time, you can also then look at what is the actual value being realized by that over time and how does that compare from a market perspective. So it's also important just to be clear as to when at what point in time are you measuring the value and what could that value look like over time can be significantly different as well. So just to add to the complexity, Deborah, in terms of how all this
That's
works.
why you do what you do. We need advisors like you. I put a plug in for that, let me tell you. And you can be way off if you don't get the right advice. And personally, I've seen that. I went into a public company. Company was just going public and they didn't engage compensation advisors in advance. Within 14 months, we were being acquired and we were way off market and there was a lot of money left on the table. And I'm not being selfish saying just from a director, but it wasn't properly applied and we couldn't go back and course correct. So I think, you know, you're going to only do it once, do it right. I'm putting a little shameless plug in there, but it is very critical. So we have one more question. I think, Amanda, it's to you just for clarity. Amanda, if I heard you correctly, you said that stock price is not considered as part of the 50% performance component of total compensation that the proxy advisors like to see. If this is correct, can you please discuss a little more why this is the case? Does that?
Yep, that's perfect. I mean, the cynic in me says because they're crazy, you know, there's direct alignment between a shareholder who owns one share and me who has a phantom share. So the cynic in me says that they are aligned. This is an unfortunate, it matters outside of Canada for sure. Our US colleagues tell us if there weren't a lot of these rules and regulations, some of the US companies would abuse systems. So these are just guidelines that are put in place to try and make sure that there is rigor in the systems we set up. So when they say, we don't really know why they said it, but Glass Lewis and ISS both say that if it is only share price performance, they will not count it towards a performance oriented LTIP. You need to put relative TSR on top or absolute TSR on top, or an operating measure, a financial measure. Once you do that, it's called performance. So even as an example, stock options, if you had a share price hurdle, even though they're stock options, they flip over to the performance category. So anything with a layer of additional performance in addition to share price or total shareholder return counts in their view. And they're just looking for that 50% rule. And again, it's just a bit of a screening exercise they use because they have so many companies to look at. So if you don't have the 50%, they dig deeper and try to understand why you do something different. So it isn't a black and white rule either. I want to make sure everyone understands. And these also are proxy advisors, meaning they give advice to shareholders, but they are not shareholders. So we, again, just have to do what's right for each organization, understanding how Glass Lewis and ISS might interpret our decisions. And we have strategies around, you know, defending your honor if you choose something else other than 50% performance share units. So yeah, we can talk about it more.
Well, and I think just to sort of add to that, like there is a lot of debate on this issue, right? Like in terms of ISS and Glass Lewis going to ask their stakeholders as to, you know, are we comfortable with this approach, or would we also be comfortable if we had longer vesting? So if we provided a unit that vested over 5 years instead of a performance-based unit that vests over 3 years, is there a trade-off there, and could we be comfortable with that? So they're testing that, and I think from an investor perspective, they were more comfortable with it than not. So that's sort of a directional, you know, thing that's interesting just to sort of think that through. But also our colleagues in the US and Variant did some research around the effectiveness of PSUs. And what was interesting is that when they compared companies that had PSUs to companies that didn't have PSUs, those ones that didn't have PSUs tended to outperform those that had PSUs. So if you go into this thinking PSUs are the thing that are going to drive better performance, the research may or may not sort of indicate that actually, you know, are we building more complexity into our programs than is needed to actually drive true outcomes? To Amanda's point, a share is a share tracks share price. And so therefore, if we have shares, we should be aligned with shareholders. You know, maybe the pendulum will start swinging back the other way over time.
Anything you'd like to close on, Amanda?
Just, I guess, reiterating that this toolkit is available for your purposes because we can only cover so much in these little snippets of 40 minutes here and 40 minutes there. And so we would encourage you to go to our website and download the full package. It's a really fulsome guide, if we don't say so ourselves, about effective human resources, committee management, and executive compensation at the boardroom. So yes,
Well,
thank you for having us again, Deborah.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Alex. And thank you, Amanda. You know, it is a complex topic, but when you bring it back to, you know, the conversation was around executive compensation governance, right? And excellence in it, right? And it is complex. And you know, again, you need advisors, you need benchmarking, you need a lot of data. You've got and it changes year to year too over time. So you just really want to be current, make sure that aligns with your strategy and your organization. That would be my key takeaway. So we want to thank you as speakers on behalf of your time and your insights. We like to give back to our charity partner, and that is Cheekbone Beauty Indigenous Scholarship Fund. So we will be making a donation on your behalf. And we want to thank Southlea Group as our national strategic partner over the years, and our committed speaker series coming out second time this year and previous years as well. So really appreciate your time. Just a note, our next speaker series is on August 13th, and it's on the topic of AI governance unveiled for modern boards. So want to thank everyone for joining us today. You will get a follow-up link. We'll make sure, I believe, if it's not in the follow-up today, we'll make sure that your HR toolkit is in the follow-up with materials. The recording will be coming out in a few days. The slides will be in your materials. There'll be a survey, so we want to hear back from you. And most importantly, have a wonderful, safe, and relaxing summer. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Deborah.